John Henry, the Hammerman, page 88. People down south still tell stories about John Henry, how strong he was, how he could whirl a big sledge so lightning fast you could hear thunder behind it. They even say he was born with a hammer in his hand. John Henry himself said it, but he probably didn't mean it exactly as it sounded. The story seems to be that when John Henry was a baby, the first thing he reached out for was a hammer which was hung nearby on the cabin wall. John Henry's father put his arm around his wife's shoulder. "He's going to grow up to be a steel-driving man. I can see it plain as rows of cotton running uphill." As John Henry grew a bit older, he practiced swinging the hammer, not hitting at things, but just enjoying the feeling of it whooshing against the air. When he was old enough to talk, he told everyone, "I was born with a hammer in my hand." John Henry was still a boy when the Civil War started, but he was a big, hard-muscled boy, and he could outwork and outplay all the other black boys on the plantation. "You're going to be a mighty man, John Henry," his father told him. "A man ain't nothing but a man," young John Henry said, "and I'm a natural man, born to swing a hammer in my hand." At night, laying on a straw bed on the floor, John Henry listened to the far-off train whistling through the darkness. Railroad tracks had been laid to carry trainloads of Southern soldiers to fight against the armies of the North. The trains had a lonesome, longing sound that made John Henry want to go wherever they were going. When the war ended, a man from the North came to John Henry where he was working in the field. He said, "The slaves are free now. You can pack up and go wherever you want, young fellow." "I'm craving to go where the trains go," said John Henry. The man shook his head. "There are too many young fellows trailing the trains around now. You better settle down to doing what you know, like handling a cotton hook or driving a mule team." John Henry thought to himself, "There's a big hammer waiting for me somewhere, because I know I'm a steel-driving man. All I have to do is hunt till I find it." That night he told his folks about the dream he had. "I dreamed I was working on a railroad somewhere," he said, "a big new railroad called the C&O, and I had a mighty big hammer in my hand. Every time I swung it, I made a whirling flash around my shoulder, and every time my hammer hit a spike, the sky lit up from the sparks." "I believe it," his father said. "You were born to drive steel." "That ain't all of the dream," John Henry said. "I dreamed that the railroad was going to be at the end of me, and I'd die with the hammer in my hand." The next morning, John Henry bottled up some food in a red bandana handkerchief, told his parents goodbye, and set off into the world. He walked until he heard the clang-clang of hammers in the distance. He followed the sound to a place where gangs of men were building a railroad. John Henry watched the men driving steel spikes down into the cross ties to hold the rails in place. 3 men would stand around a spike, then each in turn would swing a long hammer. John Henry's heart beat in rhythm with the falling hammers. His fingers ached for the feel of a hammer in his own hands. He walked over to the foreman. "I'm a natural steel-driving man," he said, "and I'm looking for a job." "How much steel driving have you done?" the foreman asked. "I was born knowing how," John Henry said. The foreman shook his head. "That ain't good enough, boy. I can't take any chances. Steel driving's dangerous work, and you might hit somebody." "I wouldn't hit anybody," John Henry said, "because I can drive one of those spikes all by myself." The foreman said sharply, The one kind of man I don't need in this outfit is a bragger. Stop wasting my time." John Henry didn't move. He got a stubborn look around his jaw. "You loan me a hammer, boss mister, and if somebody will hold the spike for me, I'll prove what I can do." The 3 men who had just finished driving in a spike looked toward him and laughed. One of them said, "Anybody who would hold a spike for a greenhorn don't want to live long." "I'll hold it," a 4th man said. John Henry saw that the speaker was a small, dark-skinned fellow about his own age. The foreman asked the small man, "Do you aim to get yourself killed, Little Willie?" Little Willie didn't answer. He knelt and set a spike down through the rail on the cross tie. "Come on, big boy," he said. John Henry picked up one of the sheep-nose hammers lying in the cinders. He hefted it and decided it was too light. He picked up a larger one which weighed 12 pounds. The handle was lean and limber and greased with tallow to make it smooth. Everyone was quiet, watching as he stepped over to the spike. John Henry swung the hammer over his shoulders so far that the hammerhead hung down against the back of his knees. He felt a thrill run through his arms and chest. "Tap it down gentle first," said little Willie. But John Henry had already started to swing. He brought the hammer flashing down, banging the spike squarely on the head. Before the other men could draw a breath of surprise, the hammer flashed again, whirling through the air like a giant hummingbird. One more swing, and the spike was down, its steel head smoking from the force of the blow. The foreman blinked, swallowed, and blinked again. "Man," he told John Henry, "you're hired." That's the way John Henry started steel driving. From then on, little Willie was always with him, setting the spikes or placing the drills that John Henry drove with his hammer. There wasn't another steel driving man in the world who could touch John Henry for speed and power. He could hammer every which way, up or down or sideways. He could drive for 10 hours at a stretch and never miss a stroke. After he'd been at the work a few years, he started using a 20-pound hammer in each hand. It took 6 men working fast to carry fresh drills to him. People would come for miles around to watch John Henry. Whenever John Henry worked, he sang. Little Willie sang with him, chanting the rhythm and clanging hammer strokes. Those were happy days for John Henry. One of the happiest days came when he met a black-eyed, curly-haired girl called Polly Ann. And on that day that Polly Ann said she would marry him, John Henry almost burst his throat with singing. Every now and then, John Henry would remember the strange dream he had years before about the C&O Railroad, Railroad and dying with a hammer in his hand. One night he had the dream again. The next morning when he went to work, the steel gang gathered around him, hopping with excitement. "The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad wants men to drive a tunnel through the mountains in West Virginia," they said. "The C&O wants the best hammermen there are," they said, "and they'll pay twice as much as everybody else." Little Willie looked at John Henry. "If they want the best, John Henry, they're going to need you." John Henry looked back at his friend. "They're going to need you too, little Willie. I ain't going without you." He stood a minute looking at the sky. There was a black thundercloud way off, with sunlight flashing behind it. John Henry felt a small chill between his shoulder blades. He shook himself, put his hammer on his shoulders, and said, "Let's go, Willie." When they reached Summers County, where the Big Bend Tunnel was to be built, John Henry sized up the mountain standing in the way. It was almost solid rock. "Looks soft," said John Henry. "Hold a drill up there, little Willie." Little Willie did. John Henry took a 70-pound hammer and drove the drill in with one mountain-cracking stroke. Then he settled down to working the regular way, pounding in the drills with 4 or 5 strokes of a 20-pound sledge. He worked so fast that his helpers had to keep buckets of water ready to pour on his hammer so they wouldn't catch fire. Polly Ann, who had come along to West Virginia, sat and watched and cheered him on. She sang along with him, clapping her hands to the rhythm of his hammer, and the sound echoed around the mountains. The songs blended with the rumble of dynamite where the blasting crews were at work. For every time John Henry drilled a hole in the mountain's face, other men poked dynamite and black powder into the hole and then lighted a fuse to blow the rock apart. One day, the tunnel boss, Captain Tommy Walters, was standing watching Henry, when a stranger in city clothes walked up to him. "Howdy, Captain Tommy," said the stranger. "I'd like to talk to you about a steam engine I've got for sale. My engine can drive a drill through a rock so fast that not even a crew of your best men can keep up with it." "I don't need any machine," Captain Tommy said proudly. "My man John Henry can outdrill any machine ever built." I'll place a bet with you, Cap'n, said the salesman. You race your man against my machine for a full day. If he wins, I'll give you the steam engine free. Cap'n Tommy thought it over. That sounds fair enough, but I'll have to talk to John Henry first. He told John Henry what the stranger had said. Are you willing to race a steam drill? Cap'n Tommy asked. John Henry ran his big hands over the handle of his hammer, feeling the strength in the wood and in his own great muscles. A man's a man, he said, but a machine ain't nothing but a machine. I'll beat that steam drill, or I'll die with my hammer in my hands. All right, then, said Cap'n Tommy. We'll set a day for the contest. All right, then, said Cap'n Tommy. Oh, Polly Ann looked worried when John Henry told her what he had promised to do. Don't you worry, honey, John Henry said. It was the end of the workday, with the sunset burning across the mountain, and the sky shining like copper. He tapped his chest. I've got a man's heart in here. All a machine has is a metal engine. He smiled and picked Polly Ann up in his arms as if she were no heavier than a blade of grass. On the morning of the contest, the slopes around the tunnels were crowded with people. At one side stood the steam engine, its gears and valves and mechanical drill gleaming. Its operators rushed around, giving it final spurts of grease and oil, and shoving fresh pine knots into the fire that fed the steam boiler. John Henry stood leaning on his hammer, as still as the mountain rock, his shoulders shining like hard coal in the rising sun. How do you feel, John Henry? Asked Little Willie. Little Willie's hands trembled a bit as he held the drill ready. I feel like a bird ready to bust out of a nest egg, John Henry said. I feel like a rooster ready to crow. I feel pride hammering at my heart, and I can hardly wait to get started against that machine. He sucked in the mountain air. I feel powerful free, Little Willie. Cap'n Tommy held up the starting gun. For a second, everything was silent as the dust in the drill hole. Then the gun barked, making a yelp that bounced against the mountains and sky. John Henry swung his hammer, and it rang against the drill. At the same time, the steam engine gave a roar and a hiss. Steam whistled through its escape valve. Its drill crashed down, gnawing into the granite. John Henry paid no attention to anything except his hammer, nor to any sound except the steady pumping of his heart. At the end of an hour, he paused long enough to ask, How are we doing, Little Willie? Willie licked his lips. His face was pale with rock dust and with fear. The machine's ahead, John Henry. John Henry tossed his smoking hammer aside and called to another helper. Bring me 2 hammers. I'm only getting warmed up. He began swinging a hammer in each hand. Sparks flew so fast and hot they singed his face. The hammers heated up until they glowed like torches. How are we doing now, Little Willie? John Henry asked at the end of another hour. Little Willie grinned. The machine's drill's busted. They have to take time to fix up a new one. You're almost even now, John Henry. How are you feeling? I'm feeling like sunrise, John Henry took the time to say before he flashed one of his hammers down against the drill. Clean out the hole, Willie, and we'll drive right down to China. Above the clash of his hammers, he heard the chug and hiss of the steam engine starting up again, and the whine of its rotary drill biting into the rock. The sound hurt John Henry's ears.